A body cuts through the sky and crashes violently into the city, hitting the ground with a sickening thud that echoes through the narrow streets as people freeze for a split second, unsure if what they just witnessed was an attack, a warning, or something far worse. And before anyone even gets close, the smell arrives first, heavy, sweet and rotten at the same time, the kind of smell that tells you this is no longer just death, this is decay, this is danger, and in that exact moment, no one there realizes that what just landed in front of them is not just a corpse, but a carrier, a vessel filled with something invisible that will move from house to house, from family to family, without asking for permission. And while it might sound almost absurd to imagine bodies being launched over city walls like stones from a siege engine, the truth is that this actually happened. And this moment marks the beginning of one of the most devastating events in human history, a disaster that would not stop at a single city or even a single country, but would spread across entire continents, wiping out populations, collapsing economies, and permanently changing the way humans live, think and understand the world around them. And it all started like this, chaotic, almost unbelievable, with a body flying through the sky carrying a disease that no one at the time could see, understand or fight. And this is where our story begins. But to truly understand how we got here, we need to go back just a few days earlier, to a time when the people of this city believed their biggest threat was outside the walls, not already inside, growing silently like an unseen enemy waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now imagine the city of Caffa just days before that moment, still alive, crowded and filled with the familiar sounds of a medieval trading hub, merchants negotiating goods brought from distant lands, sailors unloading cargo after long journeys across unpredictable seas, and ordinary people going about their lives under the illusion that the massive stone walls surrounding them are enough to keep them safe, because in their minds, those walls represent protection, stability, and control, like a physical barrier against chaos itself. But the reality is that walls only work against enemies you can see, and at that point, the greatest threat no longer depended on armies or invasion strategies, it depended on proximity, on contact, and on time. And maybe the most terrifying part of all of this is exactly that, because while everyone is looking outward, expecting an attack from the Mongol Empire, something far more dangerous has already begun to spread, silently, patiently and completely beyond the understanding of anyone living in that time. Outside those walls, the situation is anything but calm. The Mongol Empire, at that time the largest empire the world had ever seen, continues its expansion with a reputation built on speed, efficiency, and total destruction of those who resist, their armies operating with a level of discipline and coordination that made them almost unstoppable. And even though the name Genghis Khan had already become legendary, almost mythological in the minds of many, what really mattered was that the empire did not stop with him. It kept moving, surrounding cities, cutting off supply routes and applying pressure without necessarily launching immediate attacks, because a siege is not just about breaking in, it is about wearing people down, slowly, mentally, emotionally, until resistance starts to crack from the inside. And that is exactly what begins to happen in Caffa. The gates remain closed, trade comes to a halt, resources start to become limited, and the city that once thrived on movement and exchange becomes a place of waiting, tension and uncertainty, where every distant sound could signal the beginning of an assault, and every moment of silence feels even worse, because it suggests that something is building, something is coming, something that no one can fully anticipate. And then, in the middle of this tense standoff, something unexpected happens. Mongol soldiers, men who were used to long campaigns, harsh conditions and brutal combat, begin to fall sick without any clear reason. They develop high fevers, intense weakness, body aches and a rapid decline that leads many of them to die within just a few days. And in a time where there is no understanding of bacteria, no concept of infection as we know it today, these deaths are interpreted in different ways. Some see it as divine punishment, others as a curse, maybe even something supernatural, because when humans cannot explain something, they tend to fill that gap with fear, belief, or desperation, sometimes all at once. And it is within that confusion that one of the most disturbing decisions in the history of warfare is made, because instead of retreating or trying to understand what is happening, the Mongols decide to turn the situation into an advantage. They begin to use the bodies of their dead soldiers as weapons, loading them into catapults and launching them over the walls of Caffa as if they were just another projectile. And it is worth pausing here for a second to really picture that, because even by medieval standards, this is extreme. This is not just warfare, this is something else entirely. And whether they realized it or not, they were effectively turning the city into a breeding ground for something far more dangerous than any army, because those bodies were not just dead, they were infected, and by sending them into the city, they were unknowingly triggering a chain reaction that would soon spiral completely out of control. The effects of this decision are almost immediate. Within days, people inside the city begin to show signs of a strange and terrifying illness. Individuals who were perfectly healthy suddenly develop fevers, chills, weakness, and a general sense that something is very wrong, and at first, it might not seem too different from other diseases common at the time, but then things get worse, much worse. Painful swellings begin to appear. Dark spots form on the skin, and the progression of the illness becomes impossible to ignore, and without any effective medical knowledge, people try whatever they can: herbs, prayers, improvised treatments, a mix of hope and desperation that, historically speaking, rarely ends well. And while some attempt to care for the sick, others panic, because when something like this starts spreading and no one understands how or why, fear becomes the dominant force, and many begin to flee the city, believing that distance is the only way to survive, which makes sense on the surface. If the problem is here, then leaving should solve it, right? Except there is one major problem with that logic: the disease does not stay in one place, it travels with people, and those who escape Caffa unknowingly carry the infection with them, incubating inside their bodies, invisible, silent, and ready to emerge in new locations. And just like that, what started as a localized crisis begins to transform into something much larger, because each person who leaves becomes a potential starting point for a new outbreak somewhere else, creating a chain reaction that quickly crosses borders and connects regions that once seemed too distant to share the same fate. To understand why this disease was able to spread so effectively, we need to look at the broader context of Europe at the time, because the Black Death did not appear in a vacuum. It found the perfect conditions to thrive, conditions that had been building for decades. By the early 13th century, Europe was experiencing significant population growth, driven by improvements in agriculture, such as better farming techniques and increased productivity, along with a relative decrease in large-scale wars, allowing more people to survive and have children, leading to a sharp rise in population density. And while that might sound like a positive development, it also creates a major vulnerability, because the more people you have concentrated in a given area, the easier it is for diseases to spread, especially in a time when sanitation is, to put it politely, not exactly a priority. And this brings us to one of the key factors in the spread of the Black Death. Medieval cities were incredibly unsanitary, narrow streets filled with waste, poor drainage, garbage accumulation, and a constant presence of animals created an environment where disease could flourish. And among those animals were rats, a lot of rats, and not the cute cartoon kind, but real, dirty, flea-infested rats living in close contact with humans. And this is where one of the biggest misconceptions comes into play, because it was not the rats themselves that transmitted the disease, but the fleas that lived on them. Fleas that carried the bacterium responsible for the plague, acting as the true vector of infection, which makes the situation even more complicated, because we are talking about something tiny, hard to notice, and nearly impossible to control with the knowledge available at the time. And while people continued to live their lives surrounded by these conditions, completely unaware of the risk, the disease was quietly spreading, building momentum and preparing to unleash one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, a pandemic that would not only kill millions, but also reshape society, disrupt economies, and alter the course of history in ways that would be felt for centuries. And all of it can be traced back to moments like that first body falling from the sky, a moment that, on its own, seems shocking, but when placed within this larger context, becomes the spark that ignited a transformation no one at the time could have possibly imagined. At first, it doesn't look like the end of the world. It rarely does. It starts quietly, almost politely, like an uninvited guest that hasn't yet decided to make a scene. A fever here, a headache there, someone feeling unusually tired, maybe a bit nauseous, the kind of symptoms that in any other context might be ignored or brushed off as something temporary, something that will pass with rest or a prayer or whatever people used back then when modern medicine wasn't exactly a thing. And that's part of what makes it so dangerous, because in those early stages, the disease hides in plain sight, blending in with the everyday illnesses that people were already used to dealing with. But this one is different, very different, and it doesn't take long before that difference becomes impossible to ignore, because within a matter of days, the condition begins to escalate in a way that is both terrifying and unmistakable. The fever intensifies, the body weakens, the pain becomes sharper, more localized, more aggressive, and then come the swellings, the so-called buboes, painful, inflamed lymph nodes that begin to grow in areas like the neck, armpits, and groin. And these are not small, subtle changes. They can grow to the size of a lemon, sometimes even larger, hard, hot to the touch, and filled with pus. And if that description already sounds unpleasant, imagine experiencing it without any understanding of what is happening, without any effective treatment, and with the knowledge that many people who show these symptoms do not survive for long. And just like that, what started as something that could be ignored becomes something that cannot be escaped, something that takes over the body and, very quickly, the mind as well. And as the disease progresses, it doesn't just stay in one place, it spreads through the body, affecting different systems and causing a cascade of symptoms that push the human organism to its limits. Dark spots begin to appear on the skin, the result of internal bleeding and tissue damage, giving the disease its infamous name, the Black Death, because these marks are not just cosmetic, they are a visible sign that something is going terribly wrong inside, something that the body is failing to control, and in some cases, the infection reaches the lungs, transforming into a pneumonic form that makes breathing difficult, causes coughing and, most importantly, allows the disease to spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, which is about as bad as it sounds, because now it doesn't even need fleas or rats to move forward, it can jump from one human host to another with terrifying efficiency, and at that point, containment becomes almost impossible, especially in densely populated areas where people live in close quarters and have no idea that simply being near someone could put them at risk. Inside the cities, the atmosphere changes rapidly. What was once a place of commerce and daily life becomes a space dominated by fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of inevitability, because as more people fall ill, the pattern becomes clear. This is not a random occurrence, this is something systematic, something that is spreading, and once that realization sets in, behavior begins to shift, people become more cautious, more distant, but also more desperate, because caution alone is not enough. When you don't understand the rules of the game, and without that understanding, every decision becomes a gamble. Do you help a sick family member or keep your distance? Do you stay inside or try to leave? Do you trust the advice of religious leaders, local healers, or just go with whatever instinct tells you in the moment? And in many cases, instinct is driven by fear, and fear does not always lead to the best outcomes. Medical practices at the time, while well-intentioned, often did more harm than good. One of the most common methods was bloodletting, the idea being that removing bad blood from the body would restore balance and promote healing, which, from a modern perspective, sounds less like treatment and more like speeding up the problem, but back then, it was considered a legitimate approach, along with the use of herbs, ointments, and other natural substances that might have provided some temporary relief but did little to address the underlying cause. And then there were the more creative solutions, like using laxatives to purge the body of supposed impurities, which, given the already weakened state of most patients, probably didn't help much either. And while it's easy to look back and think, how did they not realize this wasn't working, the reality is that they were operating with the best knowledge they had, which just wasn't enough to deal with something of this scale and complexity. As the number of deaths begins to rise, the impact extends beyond individual suffering and starts to reshape the structure of society itself. Families are torn apart, not just by loss but by fear, because proximity becomes dangerous. Caring for a loved one could mean exposing yourself to the same fate, and this creates situations where people are forced to make impossible choices that go against basic human instincts of compassion and solidarity, and in some cases, this leads to abandonment, sick individuals left alone because others are too afraid to come near. And while that might sound harsh, it reflects the level of desperation and uncertainty that people were dealing with. Because when survival is on the line and the rules are unclear, behavior can change in ways that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Public spaces begin to empty, markets close, streets that were once crowded become eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of carts transporting bodies or the distant tolling of bells marking yet another death. And as the situation worsens, even the systems designed to manage death start to break down, cemeteries fill up, burial practices become rushed and, in many cases, inadequate, leading to the use of mass graves, because there simply isn't enough time or space to handle the volume of bodies. And in some cities, the situation becomes so extreme that corpses are left in the streets or disposed of in rivers, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity, because the alternative is allowing them to remain in homes and public areas, increasing the risk of further contamination. In the midst of all this, people search for explanations, because understanding is a way to regain some sense of control, and in the absence of scientific knowledge, those explanations often come from religion, superstition, or a combination of both. Many believe that the plague is a form of divine punishment, a response to human sin, and this belief leads to various forms of collective behavior, including prayer, fasting, and acts of penance. Some groups take this even further, engaging in self-flagellation, physically punishing themselves in the hope that this will appease whatever force they believe is responsible for the disease. And while these actions might provide a sense of purpose or relief, they do little to stop the spread of the illness, and in some cases, they actually contribute to it, especially when people gather in large groups to perform these rituals. At the same time, there is a growing tendency to look for scapegoats, because if the cause cannot be understood, it can at least be assigned, and this leads to the targeting of certain groups, often those who are already marginalized or viewed as outsiders. Accusations begin to circulate, claims that specific communities are responsible for spreading the disease, whether through poisoning water sources or other supposed actions, and these claims, fueled by fear and misinformation, result in acts of violence and persecution that add another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation, because now the crisis is not just biological, it is social, it is political, and it is deeply human in all the worst ways. Meanwhile, the disease continues to move, crossing borders, traveling along trade routes, carried by ships, caravans, and individuals who have no idea that they are part of this process, and as it reaches new regions, the pattern repeats: initial confusion, rapid escalation, widespread fear, and significant loss of life. And despite attempts to control it, whether through isolation, restrictions on movement, or other measures, the lack of a clear understanding of how the disease spreads makes these efforts inconsistent and often ineffective, because timing is everything, and in many cases, by the time action is taken, the disease has already established itself within the population. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, there are moments, small, almost invisible moments, where people try to hold on to some sense of normalcy, acts of kindness, attempts to care for others, efforts to maintain routines even when everything around them is falling apart, and these moments, while not enough to stop the overall course of the pandemic, serve as a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming crisis, human behavior is not defined solely by fear or self-preservation. There is still empathy, still resilience, still a desire to connect and support one another, even when the cost of doing so is incredibly high, and that, in a way, becomes one of the most complex aspects of this entire event. Because the Black Death is not just a story about a disease, it is a story about how people respond to something they do not understand, how they adapt, how they fail, and how they continue, even when the outcome seems uncertain at best. And as the disease tightens its grip on Europe, moving from city to city, region to region, leaving behind a trail of death and disruption, it becomes clear that this is not a temporary crisis. This is not something that will pass quickly or quietly. This is a turning point, a moment in history where the scale of the problem forces change, whether people are ready for it or not. And while no one at the time could fully grasp the long-term consequences, the immediate reality is undeniable. The world as they knew it is collapsing, not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, relentless progression that touches every aspect of life. And the question is no longer whether things will go back to normal, but what normal will even mean once this is over, if it ever truly is. As the plague continues its relentless march across Europe, something even more profound than the immediate loss of life begins to take shape, because when nearly half of a continent's population disappears within a relatively short period of time, the consequences cannot be limited to health alone. They ripple through every layer of society, affecting the economy, the structure of power, the way people see themselves, and even the way they interpret existence. And at first, the impact is purely catastrophic. Fields are left abandoned because there are not enough workers to harvest crops, trade routes collapse or become unreliable, entire villages are wiped out or reduced to a fraction of their former population, and cities that once thrived on movement and activity become quieter, slower, almost unrecognizable. And while this might sound like the kind of scenario where everything simply falls apart permanently, history has a way of being more complex than that, because out of this devastation, new dynamics begin to emerge, and they are not always what you would expect. One of the most immediate and significant changes happens in the labor system, because suddenly, workers become scarce, and when something becomes scarce, its value increases, and for the first time in generations, those who had been at the bottom of the social hierarchy, particularly peasants and laborers, find themselves in a position where they have leverage. Landowners who once dictated terms now struggle to maintain their estates, and in order to keep their lands productive, they are forced to offer better conditions, higher wages, or greater freedoms. And while this shift does not happen overnight or uniformly across all regions, it marks the beginning of a gradual transformation that weakens the rigid structure of feudalism, a system that had defined European society for centuries, and opens the door for new social arrangements, new economic relationships, and, eventually, the rise of a more flexible, more dynamic form of society. At the same time, the authority of traditional institutions begins to erode, particularly that of the Church, which had long been a central pillar of life in medieval Europe, providing not only spiritual guidance but also a framework for understanding the world. And during the plague, many people turned to religion for answers, for comfort, for a sense of meaning in the face of widespread suffering. But when prayers do not stop the disease, when religious leaders fall ill just like everyone else, And when the explanations offered fail to match the reality people are experiencing, doubt begins to grow, slowly at first, but steadily. And this does not mean that faith disappears, far from it, but it does mean that the unquestioned authority of the church is no longer as solid as it once was, and that shift in perception will have long-term consequences, influencing future movements, ideas, and conflicts that reshape the religious and intellectual landscape of Europe. Culturally, the impact of the Black Death is equally significant, because when death becomes a constant presence, something that people encounter not just occasionally but daily, it changes the way they think, the way they create and the way they express themselves. Art, literature and even everyday language begin to reflect a heightened awareness of mortality. Themes of death, decay, and the fleeting nature of life become more prominent. And while that might sound a bit heavy, it also leads to a deeper exploration of what it means to be alive, to experience joy, love, and connection in a world where nothing is guaranteed. And this shift can be seen in various works from the period, stories that capture both the tragedy and the complexity of human experience during this time. And if you ever wondered why medieval art sometimes feels a little intense, well, this is part of the reason. When your daily life includes dodging disease outbreaks and questioning the nature of existence, your artistic choices tend to reflect that. Meanwhile, attempts to control the spread of the disease continue, and among the various strategies that are tried, one stands out for its relative effectiveness: quarantine, the idea of isolating individuals or groups for a set period of time to prevent the spread of illness. And while this concept might feel very familiar today, at the time it represents a significant shift in thinking, moving away from purely spiritual or symbolic responses towards something more practical, more observational. Even if the underlying mechanisms are not fully understood, and in port cities, ships are required to wait before allowing passengers to disembark, a period that eventually becomes standardized. And although these measures are not perfect and are often implemented inconsistently, they demonstrate an early recognition that human behavior and movement play a role in the spread of disease, a realization that will become fundamental in the development of public health practices in the centuries to come. However, not all responses are as constructive, because alongside these emerging strategies, there is also an increase in fear-driven behavior, including discrimination, scapegoating, and violence against certain groups, particularly those who are already marginalized. And this pattern, unfortunately, is not unique to this period. It appears in various forms throughout history whenever societies face crises that they struggle to understand, because assigning blame can create a false sense of control, even if it does nothing to solve the actual problem. And during the Black Death, this leads to the persecution of communities who are accused, without evidence, of causing or spreading the disease, resulting in further suffering and division at a time when unity and cooperation would have been far more beneficial. But fear has a way of overriding logic, especially when the stakes are as high as survival itself. Despite all the destruction, the pandemic does not last forever. Waves of the disease come and go, affecting different regions at different times, and over the long term, a combination of factors, including changes in living conditions, gradual improvements in hygiene, shifts in population density and, eventually, advances in scientific understanding, contribute to a reduction in its impact. And while the plague never fully disappears, its ability to cause widespread devastation on the same scale diminishes, allowing societies to begin the slow process of recovery, rebuilding, and adaptation. And this process is not linear. It involves setbacks, challenges and ongoing struggles, but it also creates opportunities for innovation, for rethinking existing systems and for developing new approaches to problems that had previously been accepted as inevitable. And perhaps one of the most important legacies of the Black Death is exactly that, the way it forces change. Because before the pandemic, many aspects of society were relatively stable, even rigid, defined by long-standing traditions and structures. But when a crisis of this magnitude occurs, it disrupts those patterns, it exposes weaknesses, it challenges assumptions, and it creates space for new ideas to emerge. And while those changes are not always immediate or evenly distributed, they set the stage for developments that will shape the future, from shifts in economic organization to transformations in social relations and, eventually, to the intellectual movements that lead into the Renaissance, a period often associated with renewed interest in knowledge, exploration, and human potential. And while it would be an oversimplification to say that the Black Death directly caused all of that, it certainly played a role in creating the conditions that made such changes possible. In the end, what makes the story of the Black Death so powerful is not just the scale of the tragedy, although that alone is staggering, but the way it reveals the complexity of human society, how interconnected everything is, how a single event, or a series of events, can have far-reaching consequences that extend far beyond their original context. And it also serves as a reminder that progress is often born out of crisis, that the same forces that cause disruption can also drive adaptation, innovation and growth, even if that process is difficult, uneven, and sometimes painful. And while it is easy to look back with the benefit of modern knowledge and think about what could have been done differently, the reality is that the people living through that time were doing the best they could with the information they had, navigating a situation that was, in many ways, unprecedented. And maybe that is where the story becomes most relevant, because even though the Black Death happened centuries ago, the underlying themes remain familiar: the spread of disease, the search for explanations, the balance between fear and reason, the impact on social structures and the ways in which people respond to uncertainty. These are not just historical concepts, they are part of an ongoing human experience. And understanding this history does not just tell us what happened, it gives us insight into how we might approach similar challenges in the present and the future, hopefully with more knowledge, more preparation and, ideally, a bit more coordination. Because if there is one thing we can learn from all of this, it is that ignoring problems or relying solely on guesswork is not exactly the best strategy when dealing with something that has the potential to affect millions of lives. So when you think back to that first image, that body falling from the sky into a city that believed itself to be protected, it is worth remembering that the real threat was never just the body itself, but what it represented: the arrival of something unseen, something misunderstood, and something capable of changing the course of history. And while the people of Caffa could not have known what was coming, we do, and that knowledge, limited as it may still be, is one of the tools that allows us to face our own challenges with a bit more awareness, a bit more caution, and maybe, just maybe, a better chance of writing a different ending.